It's now time for counter-apologetics.
On our last episode, we went over the basics of this rather unique brand of Christian apologetics called presuppositionalism. The presuppositionalist believes that they don't have to give the usual evidential style proofs of God. Rather, the very act of thinking and reasoning actually presupposes the existence of God. And they offer an argument, the Transcendental Argument for God, that attempts to establish that God is a necessary precondition for the existence and the intelligibility of logic, induction, and morality, and so that all other non-Christian worldviews are necessarily incoherent. Now, we talked about the particular contents of that argument on the last episode, and we discussed that it's not as easily refuted as it may seem at first glance. Many of the arguments that atheists are more accustomed to using actually don't really apply to this argument. So if you haven't heard the first part of this series, we recommend that you go back and do that. Now in this episode, we are going to offer some arguments that directly challenge the soundness of the Transcendental Argument for God, or TAG for short. We will address each of those three areas, logic, induction, and morality, and attempt to demonstrate that Christian theism cannot provide the necessary preconditions for intelligibility for any of them. And we will also share a number of internal critiques that do presuppose the Christian worldview is true, but then go on to demonstrate that in doing so, we will necessarily lead ourselves into contradictions and absurdities. And so the Christian worldview is incoherent. What we will not be doing on this episode is answering the presuppositionalists' demand that we give ourselves an account for principles of logic, inductive reasoning, and morality from a non-theistic perspective. Those are interesting questions, and we will address them on a future episode. But first things first, we want to assess whether or not TAG is actually sound. Because if Christianity is incoherent, then the presuppositionalist has no basis on which to argue the impossibility of the contrary. Not if their own position is impossible. You may have an objection to something we say, but it might actually be addressed later on in the episode. So listen to the whole thing first before you jump in and critique it. I think that's just being charitable, and besides, it's going to make it much easier for us and any of our fans who want to listen to your critique. There are some excellent direct challenges to the Transcendental Argument for God. Some of the best critiques I've seen have come from Michael Martin, but then my hero for the week is Mitch LeBlanc, who's been writing on is it urbanphilosophy.net, yeah. .net. He has some great critiques that the presuppositionalists have tried to counter, and I haven't seen anyone where I've felt they've been successful. Michael Martin originally proposes this argument, and Mitch LeBlanc then defends it. The Transcendental Argument for God is actually vulnerable to a Euthyphro-style dilemma. So we've talked about the Euthyphro dilemma before. In the version that Martin will present, we're just swapping out the principles of logic for God's goodness. Greg Bahnsen says, what are the laws of logic, and how are they justified? We still don't have an answer to that question from a materialist standpoint, but from a Christian standpoint, we do have the answer. Obviously, they reflect the thinking of God. They are, if you will, a reflection of the way that God thinks and expects us to think. So the Euthyphro dilemma, then, is this. Does God think in a certain way because it's logical to do so, or is thinking in a certain way logical because God does it? If you take the first horn, then the principles of logic are independent of God, and so TAG fails. And if you take the second horn, then the premises of logic are not true necessarily. They're contingent on God. But if logic is contingent on God, this is going to lead to absurdities. As Michael Martin points out, quoting him, logic presupposes that its principles are necessarily true. If the principles of logic are contingent on God, they are not logically necessary. Moreover, if principles of logic are contingent on God, God could change them. Thus, God could make the law of non-contradiction false. In other words, God could arrange matters so that a proposition and its negation were true at the same time. But this is absurd. How could God arrange matters so that New Zealand is south of China and that New Zealand is not south of it? So one must conclude that logic is not dependent on God insofar as the Christian worldview assumes that logic is so dependent. It's false.
In what John Frame would reply to that, or rather what he did reply, is that, quote, logic is neither above God nor arbitrarily decreed by God. Its ultimate basis is in God's eternal nature. God is a rational God, and necessarily so, therefore logic is necessary. Human logical systems don't always reflect God's logic perfectly, but insofar as they do, they are necessarily true. Most people who are familiar with the Euthyphro dilemma are going to recognize that this is the exact same move that apologists make when we use this argument against a kind of theistic moral realism. You know, William Lane Craig will say God is necessarily good. It is not as though God somehow arbitrarily decrees the good. It is that the good is a reflection of God's necessarily good nature.
Right.
And I'm at a loss to make any kind of meaningful sense out of that.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
It's really hard. There's something really odd about the move. It's not easy to put a finger on it. I'm going to kind of summarize LeBlanc's comments. I will post a link to LeBlanc's original article so you can see how he actually expresses this. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it justice. But here's part of the problem with that. The presuppositionalist wants us to believe that God exists necessarily and logical principles exist necessarily. So logical principles aren't contingent. The two are obviously related, but clearly they want God to have the primacy in this relationship, right? They want logic to depend on God, not the other way around. I could be wrong, but I seriously doubt they would be comfortable with us swapping the terms in this claim. You know, to say something like God is not above logic, his ultimate basis is logic's eternal nature. They're not going to be cool with that.
Or logic is the precondition for the existence of God or something.
But to explain to us why God's nature could not be any other way, they evoke logic. They say it's logically impossible for God to be any other way because God is necessarily rational. Now, it seems like the primacy just switched there. It sure looks like what they're doing is they're appealing to a standard separate from God. God depends on logic. If that's not what they're saying, then the whole thing looks very circular. As LeBlanc puts it, it says, based on God's nature, it is logically impossible for God's nature to be different because God is necessarily a rational God. Seems awfully circular, but actually that might be what's intended. Maybe this is meant to be a tautology of sorts, right? God exists and logical principles exist would actually be expressing the same proposition. And there's actually some precedent for this thinking in theology. In philosophy of religion, this doctrine is known as divine simplicity. It's the idea that God is not made up of component parts.
He's identical to his attributes.
Right, exactly. God is simple, so God doesn't have qualities like goodness. God is goodness.
Right.
God is justice. He's not a being that is just. And kind of the perk of this move is that purports to show that God's attributes can't possibly contradict because actually all of God's attributes are one. They're all unified. And so you can preserve God's divine unity.
And this could actually be a reasonable answer for some kind of like deistic God or God of the philosophers, but for a Christian God, when you need to make that distinction between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and you need to have that distinction be a robust distinction, this divine simplicity is not going to cut it for you.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of theologians actually reject it. It's not at all clear how you can maintain the Trinity, right? Because the idea of the Trinity is that these are all distinct persons. Alvin Platiga, for example, thinks that this position is actually heretical. Because as he puts it, it reduces God down to a property, not a person. And the Christian God is a uniquely personal God. So this simply won't do. So I think LeBlanc rightly dismisses Frame's defense against the Euthyphro dilemma. He writes in one of his articles, it simply cannot be the case that logic is both contingent upon God's existence and logically necessary. It must be one or the other. It seems to be an understanding of the presuppositionalists that nothing can exist independently of God, but that is a very elementary mistake in philosophy of religion.